to my fellow citizens and members of the media during this difficult time. My advice to all of you is to take steps to be safe and to remain safe. I have called this media conference to bring to the attention of the public important matters which the government as an employer and the private sector as an employer have to do before workers return to workplaces after the lockdown is lifted. The issues involved are very important because they impact upon whether workers at the workplaces live or die. The ripple effect of workers being infected with COVID-19 can result in members of the public generally also being infected. These issues are very serious because they impact upon the lives of not only the workers or the families of the workers or the members of the public who have accessed the workplace, but also to the public generally. We must remember at all times that we are dealing with a killer virus. As the government takes steps to remove this lockdown and workers employed by both the state and the private sector are about to return to work, it is important before the workers return to the workplaces that special preventative measures are established at the workplaces to prevent any transmission of the coronavirus. Workers face the risk of transmission of the virus by any infected worker or by an infected member of the public who access any of the workplaces. These special preventative measures to prevent this hazard at the workplaces relate to COVID-19, and therefore the workers must know in advance, and the public also must know in advance of the workers returning to these workplaces, the special measures which the government as an employer and the private sector as an employer have put in place. Since this virus is easily transmitted, if those special preventative measures are not put in place, the spread of the virus would not only infect fellow workers, but it would result in infecting members of the public. In the long run, the workers would be infected, the families of the workers would be infected, friends of the families of the workers would be infected, and ultimately the members of the public as a general would be infected. That scenario would aggravate the public health emergency which exists in the country. Can you imagine thousands of workers all over the country returning to their workplaces without these special preventative measures in place to prevent the spread of the virus from the workers to workers and then from workers to the public? The public health emergency crisis that would arise in our country would not be acceptable. If that happens, our healthcare system would not be able to cope with such a crisis. All the gains the country have achieved over the last 2 months in the fight by the government against this virus can be lost if the government does not take steps to establish these special preventative measures at workplaces to protect the lives of workers, to prevent the spread of the virus. The government and the private sector have a duty to ensure that these special preventative measures are put in place, and the public have a right to know what these measures are. The employees have a right to know because they face immediate risks, and the public also have a right to know because they face the ultimate risk to their lives. Both the employees and the members of the public face the risk that they can be infected with the virus if these special measures are not put in place. Before I list some of the special preventative measures which ought to be put in place by the employers for workers at the workplaces, I would tell you something about the killer virus. Before I do that, however, I want to say in advance that these measures which are to be put in place ought to be put in regulations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. It is important for these measures to have teeth, and therefore they must be put in regulations to become part of the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. That would make them enforceable against the employers. Let us first hear something about the killer virus. The coronavirus continues to pose a serious threat to the lives of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. It has caused hundreds of thousands of deaths throughout the world, and more than 4 million persons have been infected. The economies of countries have been grinding to a halt because of the lockdown caused by the virus. Every day, thousands of persons are being killed by the virus and thousands are being infected. It is said that this destruction caused by COVID-19 pandemic is unlike anything we have seen before. In the United States of America, they have already started to compare their death toll to the death toll which occurred in major wars. The United States of America has said that their death toll has already exceeded that of the Vietnam War and is fast approaching the death toll from World War I. It is therefore appropriately branded as a killer virus. This killer virus poses serious dangers to our lives, and those dangers are not yet over. The virus continues to be a threat to our lives in Trinidad and Tobago. The World Health Organization and expert opinions throughout our world have been unanimous that there would not be a vaccine to kill this virus for at least another year or year and a half. This means that we have to be very disciplined over the next year or year and a half to ensure that we take all precautions to prevent ourselves from being infected with this virus. It is also accepted that there is no present treatment to cure COVID-19. Individuals who have this disease have to depend on their strong health and immune system to fight this virus. If they become infected and they become critical, they would have to get oxygen supply from appropriate oxygen supply equipment, including ventilators. This virus can be easily transmitted by someone who is infected merely by that person speaking with you or coughing in your presence. That is why it is important for persons to wear face masks and to practice social distancing. The virus can also survive on surfaces such as chairs, desks, furniture, handrails, doorknobs, etc. It means that touching these surfaces with your hands and then placing your hands near to your nose and parts of your face can cause you to be infected with this virus. This highlights the importance of sanitizing offices and ensuring that offices are regularly disinfected. Another important factor is that persons who are infected with this virus may not show any symptoms of being infected. In other words, someone who you do not think is infected with this virus, because that person is not showing any symptoms of being infected, can infect you with the virus. Translating that fact to what can happen at workplaces without the establishment of these special preventative measures, infected workers who do not show any symptoms of having the virus can infect workers who do not have any symptoms of the virus. The vulnerable group, which is an easy target for this virus, consists of persons who are 65 years and over, those with lung disease, those with heart condition, diabetes, kidney problem, and liver disease. It is said that in most cases, when these persons get an attack of this virus, they cannot survive. We have to bear in mind that this virus is deadly. It is a killer. It kills human beings. It can kill you. It can kill me. That killing can occur within a few days if you are infected. There is no vaccine to kill this virus in the human body. There is no cure for this virus. The virus is easily transmitted from human being to human being. Hundreds of thousands of people in the world have died, and thousands of people are being infected on a daily basis. My fellow citizens, this is a serious matter. We cannot take it lightly. We have to ensure that government takes all the necessary steps and measures to protect the lives of the workers at their workplaces. If their lives are not protected at their workplaces, their lives are in jeopardy. They can be killed by this virus. All members of the public, including us, can share the same fate as those workers. This is not a workers' problem. This is a national problem. All of us have a stake in ensuring that the lives of the workers are protected at the workplaces. The most important ammunition against the virus is to prevent it from spreading. This is recognized by the World Health Organization and by governments throughout the world. That is the reason for governments having lockdowns, staying home orders, social distancing, and the wearing of face masks. All those precautions are being taken because it is recognized that therefore that special preventative measures must be put in place to prevent the spread of this virus at the workplaces. Otherwise, death to workers can result in the failures to do so, and members of the public can also die. Since the most effective weapon against the virus is to prevent the spread of the virus, if workers are allowed to return to work in conditions without these measures being put in place, there is the risk that the workers would be infected with COVID-19. There would also be the risk that infection would occur with the workers' families and with with members of the public who access the workplace. And the ripple effect of the workers being infected with the virus is that the general public would be infected with the virus also. Can you imagine the health crisis we would have in Trinidad and Tobago if several thousands of persons all over the country are infected with this virus? They would have to depend upon their immune system to survive. Some of them would need oxygen to save their lives. We would have to get ventilators to give them oxygen. Our health system in Trinidad and Tobago is not likely to be able to cope with such a public health emergency and crisis. Before I list some of the special preventative measures which I believe ought to be established at the workplaces, I want to deal with some of the principles of law which govern the duty of the state as an employer and the private sector as an employee. I am doing this because it must be clearly understood that in addition to the moral duty both the government and the private sector as employers have to the workers, they are also mandated by the laws of Trinidad and Tobago to establish special preventative measures to protect the lives of the workers. In respect of the workers who are employed by the state, the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago guarantees to those workers the right to life. The courts have held that the right to life to workers impose a constitutional obligation on the state to take positive action at the workplace of workers to protect their lives where the lives of workers in the work environment are exposed to potential threats to death. COVID-19 poses a threat to the lives of the workers if these preventative measures are not put in place. If the state does not take steps to establish preventative measures to prevent the workers from being exposed to this risk, the state would not be upholding the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago. Workers and trade union would be entitled to go to the court to get remedies. The Occupational Health and Safety Act protects both the workers employed by the state and the workers employed by the private sector. The provisions of that act mandate the employer to ensure that workers and persons who visit the workplace are not exposed to hazards to their health and safety. The hazard in this case is the hazard related to COVID-19, in that the workers at the workplaces face transmission by infected fellow workers and fellow members of the public. The common law of Trinidad and Tobago also protects private sector employees, in that the common law mandates the private sector employer to take steps to ensure that there is a safe system of work at the workplace. A safe system of work would not include a work environment in which the workers are exposed to the potential danger of death from COVID-19, and the employer knows of those dangers, but omit to take special preventative measures to prevent the worker from being exposed to those dangers. Section 4A of the Constitution guarantees to every individual in Trinidad and Tobago the right to life and the right not to be deprived thereof except by due process of law. Due process of law requires the government as part of the state to take positive duties to protect the individuals from being exposed to the risk of losing their lives because of potential dangers. So as I said before, the workers who are employed by the state would be entitled to take action against the state. The workers who are employed by private sector would be entitled to take action against the private sector employee. The workers who are employed by state companies and public authorities which do not comprise the state would be entitled to take action against the public authority or the state enterprise. All employees in Trinidad and Tobago, therefore, whether they're employed by the state or employed by the private sector or employed by the state-owned companies, regional corporation, municipal corporations, or any other public authority, are protected either by the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, or the common law of Trinidad and Tobago for workers to use the law to compel the state and or the private sector employer to establish the necessary preventative measures at their workplaces to prevent workers from being exposed to the risk of death from COVID-19. The court system. On a daily basis, hundreds of persons throughout the country go to court buildings, whether it is the Magistrates Court, the High Court, or the Court of Appeal. It is therefore easy for workers in those courts, in the absence of special preventative measures, to be infected with the coronavirus. It is therefore important for special preventative measures to be put in place in the courts so that the staff of the courts would not have the risk of being infected with the coronavirus. It follows that if a staff member of the court gets infected, that staff member can infect other staff members, and staff members can infect members of the public, and that can ultimately result in infection to the general public. In order to prevent such a situation, measures can be put in place for persons in the magistrate's court to attend court at special time, so that you would not have at 9 o'clock in the morning all persons, hundreds of persons congregating in the courts or outside the courts. The administrative arm of the judiciary, therefore, also must take steps to establish special preventative measures in the courts to prevent the administrative staff of the courts and members of the public to be exposed to the risk of being infected with the virus. Social media has reported an example of what happened in America in a court in which preventative measures were not taken to prevent the risk of infection from the coronavirus. In the Brooklyn Supreme Court in the United States of America, on the 12th of March 2020, lawyers, court officers, and clerks sat in a courtroom doing business as usual. The judge presiding was Judge Johnny Lee Baines. There was no social distancing, no face mask. 2 weeks later, the judge died from the infection related to coronavirus, and lawyers and court clerks and judges in the courthouse also contracted the virus. Some of the special preventative measures that I've been talking about. I would now proceed to state some of the special preventative measures which I believe ought to be established at the workplaces. Employers must screen any worker at the time they report for work to find out whether they have any observable symptoms associated with COVID-19, such as fever, cough, sore throat, redness of eyes, shortness of breath, or difficulty in breathing. Employers must require every worker to report whether they suffer from any of those symptoms. The employee having been screened by determining whether the employee has symptoms. If he or she has such symptoms, the employer should not permit the worker to enter the workplace to report for work. The worker should be isolated and provided with the necessary medical evaluation. Employers ought to have available the necessary medical apparatus to do testing and contact tracing. All employers must take measures to ensure that all work surfaces and equipment are disinfected before work begins and regularly during the working period and after work ends. Also, the common areas such as toilets, door handles, shared equipment should be regularly cleaned and disinfected. Every employer must, at no cost to the employee, ensure that there are sufficient quantities of hand sanitizer based on the number of workers or other persons who access the workplace. If the worker interacts with the public, the employer must supply the worker with sufficient supply of hand sanitizer at that station for both the worker and the person with whom he or she is interacting. The employer must ensure that there are adequate facilities for the washing of hands with soap and clean water. Workers would require to wash their hands and sanitize their hands regularly while at work. The employer should provide paper towels for the workers to dry their hands after washing them. They should not use fabric towels because the virus can survive on the fabric. The employer should provide cloth masks, and workers should be requested to wear cloth masks during work to reduce the amount of droplets being coughed by any individual at any time and to prevent the worker from being infected by others. The physical distance of 6 feet apart should be kept at the workplace, but if that is not practicable to follow at any given time, all persons should wear face masks. The employer ought to take the necessary steps to establish the necessary administrative measures to have one of its employees responsible for ensuring the preventative measures put in place are complied with. The employers should take steps to have a workers' committee who would work with this representative of the employer to monitor the implementation of the measures. The Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, the principles of the common law mandate the government to take steps to ensure that these special preventative measures are put in place before the workers return to work. If the government does not do that, it would be offending the provisions of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, and the common law of Trinidad and Tobago. The state as an employee and the private sector as, the state as an employer and the private sector as an employer have a duty to make public these special preventative measures, which they intend to establish to protect the lives of the workers. They have to make these measures public because the failure to establish adequate measures to protect the lives of the workers would not only threaten the lives of the workers and their families, but because of the ripple effect of the infection of the worker and or members of the family of the workers, that would result in the lives of the members of the public also being threatened. The government can use the Occupational Safety and Health Act to establish these special preventative measures as regulations made under the Act. Under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, Chapter 8808 of Trinidad and Tobago, Section 13A provides, I quote, "Every employer has to make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risk of the safety and health of his employees to which they are exposed whilst they are at work." Section 15 of the Act, by Section 15 of the Act, an employee may refuse to work or do a particular work where he has sufficient reason to believe that there is a serious and imminent danger to himself or unusual circumstances have arisen which are hazardous or injurious to his health or his life. And where you have his in an act, it also refers to her. Under Section 99 of the Act, the minister responsible for that act has the power to make regulations for the purposes of promoting the safety, health, and welfare of the employees, and generally for the purpose of carrying out the provisions of the Act. The Act specifies at Section 99(2)H that the regulations may be made to declare as dangerous a process in which persons employed are exposed to serious risk of bodily injury, poisoning, or disease. COVID-19 is a disease. At Section 99(2)E of the Act, the minister has the power to make regulations to require anything which is necessary to be done to promote the health and welfare of all employees. The Act therefore shows that the government has all the machinery to make the regulations, to introduce these special preventative measures to protect the lives of the workers and ultimately the lives of members of the public. The government can therefore use this Act to make the relevant regulations in order to establish these preventative measures to prevent the workers from getting COVID-19. In conclusion, I say the state ought to start holding consultations with the relevant trade unions and organizations, and that includes the state, that includes the members of the private sector also as employers. So they must have consultations with these trade unions and organizations which represent the workers in order to formulate and to get consensus on the special preventative measures which have to be established before the workers can return to their workplaces. The state and the private sector ought to be open and transparent with these preventative measures. And as I said, they must be made public so that the public would know and would be able to judge for themselves whether the measures are adequate or not to protect the workers and ultimately to protect their lives. Thank you very much, members of the media. I am prepared to answer any questions. I have my personal assistant here, Ms. Victor, who will try to assist me with that process.
Mr. Maharaj.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
Hi, Alessia Boucher from TV6. I'm just trying to find out, okay, so you're saying that these measures should be put in place before workers return to work. And I know that the business sector was clamoring for the reopening of the economy, and they were disappointed by, I guess, the relaxed or the beginning of the relaxed measures which allowed food outlets to operate. given, how long these things usually take in terms of consultation and so forth, how long do you think, in terms of getting this into law, that it will take before, the reopening of the business or the business side of the economy can be done?
Well, I don't think it will take very long. It can take days, as a matter of fact, because most of these measures are measures which have been accepted by the world community, the World Health Organization. It is recognized as measures which must be taken if you need at the workplace to fight this virus. As a matter of fact, the World Health Organization has literature which states what must be done at the workplaces. I have taken a lot of the things that I've said from some of that literature, and other countries have made regulations in order to ensure that the workers are safe at the workplaces. So I am hoping that one of the reasons that the government has been waiting, I'm hoping that they are working on this. And so I would expect that regulations in this could be made effective, because the regulations are made by the minister, and this can be effected within a week.
So then let me just ask you, how do you feel about the fact then that these regulations, they've not been put into law, but you have a critical part of the business economy right now, which is the food sector functioning?
Well, I think that is a mistake, but I think that it can be corrected. And that is why the World Health Organization has been asking governments to be aware of the measures which have to be introduced. And it would seem to me that these measures really should have been put in place in respect of all employment which had to be reopened. If you have a small office, I would suppose that most of the employers would have read up and would have taken steps in order to do that. Speaking for myself, I have taken steps as an employer in order to do that, and I would expect that employers would do that. But where you have the state as one of the largest employers in the country, hundreds or if not thousands of people, I think that you need regulations in order to protect the lives of the workers and lives of the public. I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, you have.
Hello.
Any other questions? Ladies and gentlemen.
Hello.
Hello, sorry, I'm hearing you.
All right. Hi, Mr. Maharaj. Clean Contact
Yeah.
of Newsday here.
Good. Mm-hmm.
Good. I just want to, continuing along the vein of these questions here. The situation being as it is, what is your opinion about these businesses? Like, you see, like the TTMA, they want to reopen next week, and then you have smaller businesses asking why they're not reopening, and some of the owners of these businesses have political ties to the last government. But the point is that you have businesses who are not included in the first phase of the reopening, clamoring to open, but they're not really providing any real evidence that they are taking measures on their own to safeguard against COVID-19. Is it not a bit unreasonable for these people to be clamoring for a reopening when they are not providing evidence of safety measures being taken on their part?
Well, I believe that the government should reassess the businesses which can be open, because it may be that a lot of businesses can be open provided that they take these measures and they implement these measures. But the government should have some mode of monitoring and ensuring that these measures are put in place. With respect to some of the businesses which have not put these measures in place, and the government is saying that you have to put them in place as a condition precedent, I think the government is entitled to do that, because one has to understand that this is not a virus that you will merely get the flu. This is a virus which will kill people. And therefore, the government has a duty to protect the lives of people, to ensure that
Yes.
lives are protected and measures are put in place. But there are some other businesses, small businesses, which I think with the government looking at it carefully, these businesses can be opened with certain conditions being put, because it's also important for businesses to open for the economy to function, but it's also very important for human lives to be protected.
Mhm. Yes. You were mentioning a little bit earlier about the power that trade unions have, and you would be aware that trade unions are now considered essential under the regulations in terms of their operation. So they have made, the labor movement has expressed the view that a lot of these employers, and particularly in the private sector, seem to be putting profit over the safety of workers and maybe by extension the public. So what do you think what is your take on that particular view?
Well, I think the trade unions would be entitled to demand that the employers put matters in place to satisfy the health requirements of the worker, because I think the human resource is more important than the financial resource. A country, the most important resource in a country is the human resource. And therefore, I think that the government is entitled to demand that unless the particular company or the trade union movement is entitled to demand that unless the employer put the requisite measures in place, that they should not expose the workers to that risk. But I mentioned the law. I mentioned the law also. The employer cannot merely sit back and do not take steps to put these measures in place. The workers can, as a condition precedent for going to work, demand that these measures are put in place. And as I read from the Occupational Health and Safety Act, that a worker can refuse and lawfully refuse to work if he or she believes that his or her life is in jeopardy by the conditions which exist in the work environment.
All right. I wanted to ask as well, given the situation that we're facing right now, some businesses there may be some businesses here who might not be able to comply with these types of measures. Are we possibly running the risk of these businesses going under and perhaps seeing a rise in unemployment, perhaps?
Well, I think that would be a matter for the government to assess. It depends on the measure that the employer cannot provide. But I think that some of the measures, especially with small business, some of the measures are very easy to comply with. We're talking in terms of masks, sanitizers, water. Those are easy, simple requirements. And if you're an employer with a big company, you should be able to comply with these requirements or with most of the requirements.
Okay, right. One last thing I wanted to ask you here. I mean, within some of these calls for reopening, now some of these persons who are calling for reopening, as I mentioned earlier, they are known persons aligned to the last government, and there still continues to be a lot of politics being infused into calls for reopening and other aspects of dealing with the COVID-19 situation. What is your take on this persistence by some people to try to be using this particular scenario, this particular situation we are in, to promote a political agenda?
Well, I do not think this issue should be politicized. This is an issue facing all of us in Trinidad and Tobago. I personally think that we should put politics away from this. But having said that, I believe that the government has a duty to look at some of the businesses, some of the small businesses. For example, a hairdressing salon. These are businesses which are open in other parts of the world, and they have put measures in place to prevent persons from getting COVID-19. And one sees that in England, in America, in Canada, those things are happening. So I think in some of the small businesses like beauty salons and etc., you can put things in place to prevent the infection from COVID-19. And I could think of a lot of other businesses, small businesses. So I think the government should really reassess the position of some of these businesses. But I also think that we should not use the politics or party politics in a matter like this. This is not an issue for party politics. This is a matter. This is a matter which transcends party politics.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mr. Maharaj, Alicia Boucher here again.
Yes.
I know one of the measures that you would have mentioned is a workers' committee being set up to ensure implementation of the measures that you are hoping becomes part of the regulations under the OSH Act. Do you think that these, similar to how food places are perhaps monitored by health, I mean, I'm not sure what the complement of staff at the Ministry of Health in terms of public health regulators would have to be, but do you think that that should also form a part of it, that businesses are visited by public health officers to ensure compliance, that there is some measure of compliance?
Oh, yes, I think so. And under the Public Health Act, the public health officers would have that power. And I think there is provision under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, where officials of the state would have that power. But I think in respect of COVID-19, it may need a specialized person who would be able to know some of the things which can be done and which cannot be done, and would be able, when they go to these premises, to see whether what is being done adversely affect the health and the life of people. And it may be that you could have such a special person. I think that is something that government can introduce in the regulations if they decide to do it.
And go ahead.
Sorry. No, sorry, go ahead.
No, because I was going to say, and what about, other businesses who, may say, well, once you put these things into regulations to determine whether or not your business is allowed to reopen, you may have other businesses, let's say bars, nightclubs, that may be able to put these measures in place, but then, the obvious challenges that they have in terms of having people congregating and so forth. But then they may argue that they are being discriminated against because they have the measures in place and they are not being allowed to open. Do you foresee that being a problem at all?
Well, that could be a problem, because I think if the businesses have the measures in place and they can comply with the guidelines and the measures which the World Health Organization has recognized can be done, and if you can comply with those guidelines and you're not permitted to open, then one may be able to say that that is not being treated equally, and that can be unequal treatment. So that is why I think that the government has to look at this thing very carefully. And as long as businesses have complied with the guidelines which are needed, these measures which are needed to make the workers safe, to make the public safe, I think the government has an obligation to ensure that people operate their businesses. If the government does not do that, the businesses would have a remedy in court, because under the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, what happens is that the Constitution in effect guarantees that the government, in the exercise of its power, must not do anything or refuse to do anything which will trample on the right to equality of treatment.
Okay. Would these, in terms of once these additional measures are put into the OSH Act, is it that, the fines and so forth for breaking them would remain the same under the OSH Act, or would you also have to then work that out as COVID-19 is new? Would you have to kind of work out new fines for breaking it, new amount of jail time for breaking it if you do? I'm not sure how that would work.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. As a matter of fact, I would expect that there'll be different fines, because we are not dealing with a hazard which will merely cause a sickness. We are dealing with a hazard which can result in a short time in death. So I think breaches of those regulations, if they are put in regulations, if the government decide to make regulations, ought to attract a different kind of punishment. But that will be a matter of the policy of the government. And that is why the government ought to publish these measures. I would have expected that they would, if these measures were going to be put in place, that the public would have had these measures before. Because based on everything that the government is saying, that is expected that in the month of June, many businesses would be reopened and people would be going to work. So I would expect, we are now in the middle of May, that whatever these measures are going to be law, members of the public are entitled to know what they are. The employers are entitled to know, and the workers are entitled to know. The trade unions would be entitled to know. So I would expect to see or hear something that happens in the next few days. Bearing in mind, and I do not want this to be, it must be as a last resort. Bearing in mind that if the government, and when I say this, if any government in Trinidad and Tobago does not take steps in a similar situation like this to enact the relevant measures and regulations to protect the workers' lives, and which can result not only in death to workers, but can result to other people dying, members of the public. That is not only a serious breach of the right, of the rights under the Constitution and the law for workers and members of the public. It is something which I am sure the trade union movement will challenge in the courts, and you will end up in major litigation. And therefore, I do not think this is a matter should reach the courts. I think this is a matter in which the government should engage in consultation and try and have an answer quickly, so that the workers can feel satisfied and members of the public can feel satisfied, and the business community can reopen their businesses.
These amendments can be done
within
in terms of with
it
right,
doesn't
with
need
simple
parliament.
majority, right?
It's done by a minister.
Okay.
Under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the parliament gave the minister the right to make regulations and specified the circumstances and gave a general omnibus clause that they can make regulations. I referred to some of that in my contribution. So therefore, the minister can make these regulations. Only the cabinet has to approve this, or the minister has to approve it.
Okay.
And most of the things that I said here, one can take it, it's from the guidelines given by the World Health Organization. So it's nothing that is controversial, and any law ministry will have that information, and it will be able to be done in days.
Thank you, Mr. Maharaj.
Thank you.
Mr. Maharaj?
Yes, please.
Anil Skiratan, Caribbean Lifestyle Communications.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hi, good day. I just want to find out, I want to pick up on where you last left off. We had a former judge challenging, questioning the legality of the COVID-19 restrictions. Could you clear the air on that for us, please? And also, do you support the phased reopening of the economy as set out by government? Thank you.
Well, I have a certain opinion about about how the government has implemented the measures relating to staying home and closing of businesses. And I express that opinion in that I believe that the government should have utilized the Constitution to have a limited state of emergency. The government has opted to use the Quarantine Act and the Public Health Act by making regulations under the Public Health Act to effect these measures. And I would prefer at this time not to talk about that, my personal opinion. But what I believe is that government should look and examine the law carefully. And if these regulations have to be extended for any length of time, I think what should happen, the government should reassess its position and determine how it is going to go forward. Under the state of emergency, the government is given, under the Constitution, the government is given the power if you have an emergency, and if obviously if you have a public health emergency as COVID-19, that it has the power to do certain things to restrict fundamental rights, but it also provides a quick machinery for decisions to be reviewed, so that you have a review tribunal and there is a process. Under the present system, which the government has used, in that if you have to review a decision, you will have to go for judicial review, which can take a very long time and which would not be completed by the time the emergency period is finished in any event. But having said that, I would like you to bear with me, and I prefer to reserve the reasons for my opinion until after all of this is completed.
Okay, thank you. That's fair enough.
Thank you. With respect to the phase, going back into business or reopening of business, I think the government is acting properly in that respect. I think that the government recognizes, and if I may say so, as a citizen, I think over the last few months, the government did a very good job in the circumstances. And I think that if I were in government, that is the kind of approach I would have recommended. So I think that one cannot criticize the government for that approach. What I think, however, that the government has done a good job so far, but the government has a duty to reassess the entire position now, and some of the businesses, especially some of the small businesses, should be able to be reopened, because not only is a suffering of the business person, members of the public are suffering from that as a result.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm Mr. Maharaj Atram from the Trinidad Guardian newspaper here. You spoke earlier about measures being implemented for the court system, the judiciary. Have you been able to participate in virtual hearings that have been being used by the judiciary thus far? And what's your opinion? If so, what is your opinion on them? How do you think can they be used more going forward?
Well, I have been able to participate in a virtual hearing which was conducted by the Privy Council, in which the judges remained at their homes. I have been able to participate in virtual hearing in Trinidad, where the judge was in chambers. I think the virtual hearing is a good concept, and I think it can be very beneficial. Having said that, however, it is not every court hearing can be done by a virtual hearing, because especially in certain kind of cases, especially if the case has a public interest, and depending on the history of the case, I think that would not be an appropriate case for a virtual hearing. So where you have to have cross-examination of witnesses and an entire trial, it may not be appropriate. So it depends on the particular case. But we have to remember that in a court hearing, that there are two sectors of the public which constitute a court hearing, quite apart from the judges and the lawyers, the members of the media and the members of the public. The common law, which we inherited from England, is that in any trial, a civil trial or criminal trial, the members of the press are entitled to witness that trial. And members of the public who want to go to court must be able to have access to see that trial in action. It is called the principle of open justice. So although the virtual hearings are good and can satisfy the requirements of the law in certain respects, it cannot be a replacement for open justice. And that is why in some countries where you have these virtual hearings, what the authorities have done is to open up the system so that the court proceedings are streamed, so that members of the public can see it and all members of the media can have access to it. And the reason for that law, for that common law for open justice, is that the public must be able to scrutinize what the courts do, what the judges do, how the judges behave, how the lawyers behave, and to come to a conclusion themselves as to whether justice is being done and is appeared to be done, and appears to be done. So I hope I've answered the question to you.
Yes, you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any more questions?
Yeah, I have, hello? Yeah, I have one more question.
Yes.
Clint Chansaki again. Just continuing on from Derek's question there. Do you think that our judiciary is capable of handling that sort of streaming process that you described in terms of providing an open justice, as it were? Because I know the under the current system where we are right now, I mean, the virtual proceedings were used for assessing prisoners who can't, low-risk prisoners who can't be released and all of that. But you seem to be suggesting, Mr. Maharaj, that that the use of virtual proceedings should not be something which is a norm in our justice system. So I was just wanting to ask you from that point of view, could the types of streaming to allow the types of transparency and openness that you're talking about, is our judiciary capable of doing that at this point in time? Or they need some help to get that going?
Well, I think that should not be an issue, because if one is appointed a judge and one is appointed on the Court of Appeal, there must be the presumption that the person should be able to face that scrutiny. Having said that, however, I want to say that I am of the view that our judges are quite capable, but I must say that I think that the appointment process and the promotion process of judges leave much to be desired. The public is left out of the whole process. The legal profession is left out of the whole process. And the judiciary perform a very important function in our society. The judiciary is the guardian of the Constitution. And a famous judge once said that if you do not put persons who are competent as judges in any society, or if you do not elevate persons to the Court of Appeal in any society, the pipeline for justice in that society can be blocked. And I think that is one of the reasons why it probably would be a good thing in Trinidad and Tobago for the justice system to be open up, to be more transparent, and for the courts proceedings to be streamed, because the public would then be able to judge for themselves, and it would not be the opinion of a lawyer. But I must pay tribute to some of the very good judges we have in our High Court and in the Court of Appeal. They can match the judges anywhere in the world. But what happens is that if there's a perception of appointments which are made which should not be made, or which are made when judges are being bypassed for promotion, or appointments which the public did not have an opportunity to assess, and the legal profession did not have an opportunity to assess, what it then does is that it becomes a slur on the whole system. And I think there's a lot to be done for the improvement of the appointment and elevation process of judges in Trinidad and Tobago.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Well, thank you, members of the media. I miss you. I haven't seen you all for a long time. So I miss you. So I look forward to seeing you again.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Mirage. We look forward to seeing you again once again.
Yes, Mr. Mirage. Thanks, and stay safe.
Okay.
Yeah, have a good one.
Okay, thank you. All the best.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to be sending the recording, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks again. Appreciate the invitation.